So as I was thinking about what story to tell, I was on a really long drive last week. I had to drive 6.5 hours down to the Outer Banks, and so I was driving and thinking, and the road is flying by, and I'm thinking of all of these things that sort of relate to getting around. And the two things that really stuck in my mind that I thought were interesting about getting around is when people who can't get around as easily as other people, and for a lot of us that's when we were children, we've all had that experience of not having as much mobility. And then also just the way that we use so many metaphors about travel and movement and transit to think about our lives. And so that's really what kind of got my brain going about getting around. When I was little, I grew up in Charlotte, and we lived in a little yellow house on a street called Montezuma Trail when I was a wee, not very mobile thing. And my great-grandmother lived across the street, and my uncle lived a few houses down. And so I had this sort of little network in my neighborhood that I knew that I could travel and with my big sister. And that's as a kid, your map of the world is this very small thing, and you don't have very many connections. You have these little islands of places, like there's my school, and there's my grandma's house, and there's my house, but I don't know how you get between them. So they just sort of float out there, and then as you get older, and I had a big wheel that I would ride around the neighborhood on, and my neighbor, she had a big wheel, and one day she went on her big wheel for 3 miles, and no one noticed. I'm sure someone noticed, but this 4-year-old is on her big wheel, and she just goes and goes and goes, and I just wonder if she was really angry, or if she just had that feeling of I'm going forward, and you just keep going forward because you can. And our mailman picked her up. His name, special delivery. His name was Howard, and when we were little, we would stand by the mailbox waiting for Howard to come because he would always give us candy. And then until I choked on a piece of the candy, and so I didn't get candy anymore, he would give me little sugary cereal boxes, which is also very exciting. We had to eat healthy things in our house. We didn't have sugary cereals. So Howard, the mailman, I remember my mom always being afraid that the kids in our neighborhood were going to get hit by cars because we're all incentivized to stand by the street, waiting for the mailman to come with the candy. But he found our neighbor and brought her back after her long foray into the wilds of the neighborhood. Who knows where she could have gone? She could have gotten far, a few miles in the neighborhood. But so, and then I remember we moved to Black Mountain when I was about 7 years old, and so then I had a bike, a real bike, and I could really ride. And my neighbor Katie and I, we'd ride our bikes down to the Wendy's, and that was the big independence. We'd go to the Wendy's, and we'd get Frosties with French fries, and dip the French fries in the Frosties, and that was really fun. And I also, in my neighborhood down the other way, there was a horse farm that I could walk to, and we actually had a horse for 2 years when I was a kid. Sounds so very charmed. I had a pony when I was little, and I could walk down the street and go visit it. And sometimes we'd ride the pony to Wendy's, and we'd ride the pony through the drive-through, which was difficult because she doesn't set off that little dinghy thing that tells them that there's somebody there. So we'd have to go all the way to the window and just sort of peer in the window, okay, we're ready to order. We would like a sandwich, and so got to ride the pony, and that was sort of expanding, going a little bit further in each little journey and with each kind of new form of transportation. And the one form of transportation I don't think I've used very much in my life are taxis, because in Asheville, to me, the thought of taking a taxi in Asheville is just laughable, and I grew up here, and so I remember in 6th grade I had a teacher who would take us on van trips. This was Mr. Grover. He was my math teacher at Asheville Middle School in 6th grade. And he'd take us on van trips, and part of it was to reward you for being good in his class, but part of it was also to teach adult skills. And so every time we'd go on the trip, he'd be like, now if you get lost, you just remember New Bluebird Cab, and you call New Bluebird Cab. I'm not waiting for you with the van. And he'd take us to the mall, but he would also take us he would drive us by apartment buildings, and he'd be like, now, in this apartment building, rent here is $800 a month, but if you want to live without, cockroaches in your house, then, we drive us over to the other side of town, well, here you have to pay, your rent here is $1,000 a month, but, And yes, those are my first lessons about credit cards and things, just driving around in this van with Mr. Grover, spouting off about apartment complexes and things, and telling us how to call a cab, which I never did. And I still think of cabs as, you only take cabs if you're drunk or if you're going to the airport, because that's the only time that it's like reasonable to pay that much money for someone else to drive you somewhere. So yeah, taxis, I haven't been in a lot of taxis. I was visiting a friend in DC recently and got in a cab, and I just immediately got on my smartphone and like started sending an email, because I just felt like a really big city girl, like just sitting back in the cab sending an email. That's exciting. So yes, continue these little forays that continue, and going. I remember graduating from high school and having this idea of, when you graduate and everybody gives you that Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, and you have this sense of like embarking on this path, and that your life is this path to this top of a shining mountain, and just that idea that, that our lives are roads and we're going in sort of one direction, I think is really prevalent. And I always struggled with that when I was in school, because I really felt like once I got into college, I went to a college in the Midwest, and I wasn't really happy there, and I really sort of struggled against that idea of this one path that I was taking. But you see it everywhere, just these ideas about, now my mind fails me, but there's so many songs that use that kind of language about our lives and stuff like that. So midway through school, I transferred schools, and around that time, I started thinking of my life instead of as a roadway, I started thinking of it as a landscape, and that, there's all these little places to explore. There's a little mountain over here, and there's a stream, and, there is a path, but I don't have to be on the path. I can kind of step off the path and go explore over here for a little while, and then come back to the path, see where it goes. And that really helped me make sense of that decision of changing paths and doing a new thing that felt unusual and strange, and everybody else was, why are you doing this? I was like, I don't really know, but I don't think that what I'm doing is working. And I think that, when we think of our lives and things like that as this path, we really have a hard time stepping out of that. It's like roads, well, where a road is, it must go somewhere that you want to go, because somebody put it there first, and so you can get into that sort of marching along a road kind of an idea. But lately, my metaphor for my life has been, there's a lot of change going on in my little world right now, and I thought of myself as driving down an on-ramp onto an interstate, and when you get to the bottom and the traffic hasn't moved over, but you can't stop. That's like against my religion, to stop at the bottom of an on-ramp. I hate when people do that. Like, it's a yield sign, yes, but you can't exactly merge into 60-mile-an-hour traffic if you're stopped on the side of the road. So you get to the bottom of the on-ramp, and you're just like, okay, here we go, I'm just going to keep going, and you're looking over your shoulder just hoping that everybody else gets out of your way because you're merging into them. And that's sort of what I feel like I'm doing in my life right now. Like, all this change is happening. I'm just like, okay, well, here we go, and is there anybody there? Here we go. And so, yeah, that's the little node on the landscape that I'm on now. Yeah, so it's not really a story per se, it's just sort of these wandering thoughts. But the thing that struck me as I was driving on my 6.5-hour drive and having these wandering thoughts is that, our brains are really wired in the same way that sort of our road networks are, and these ideas of connections and nodes, and they're very similar. And I was like, isn't that interesting? And, traveling new paths must make new paths in our brains at the same time. And then I just bought a house. That's a whole different story, but as I was unpacking, I found this stack of things, and I come from a family of article clippers, and so I had this stack of articles from my grandma, and they all had my name written on them so lovingly, and it's like, oh geez, I should read these articles so that I can get rid of them. And so I read one, and it was about this physicist came up with this universal theory of everything inanimate and how the rules of those things and how they develop it. Basically saying there's a reason why our neural networks look like our road networks, which look like our capillary networks and river networks and even trees. He calls it constructal theory, and that basically the idea is that everything is designed to help us flow and to help things move through the world. And so all those systems start to look really similarly if you just kind of look at them in silhouette. And I was like, yeah, I could have told you that. Like, where's my PhD? I learned that just yesterday when I was on the driving. So that's my story.